What if we asked a difficult but honest question today? Has Christianity ever stood in the way of science? It's a complicated question, because on one hand, Christianity has inspired some of history's greatest minds. On the other, we can't ignore a long and visible pattern where religious institutions, especially in the name of Christianity, have pushed back hard against certain scientific ideas. Sometimes with good intentions, other times with consequences that slowed down human progress. So let's explore this together, not to argue, not to attack, but to think carefully and clearly. Let's start with a familiar story, Galileo Galilei. Galileo was a devout Catholic, but in the early 1600s, his support for heliocentrism, the idea that the earth revolves around the sun, put him in direct conflict with the Church. At that time, the dominant view, based on interpretations of the Bible, was that the earth was the center of the universe. Galileo's science said otherwise, but instead of welcoming the discovery, the Church tried him for heresy. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. His work was banned, his ideas suppressed. This wasn't about bad people doing bad things. It was about a system that had become so sure of its own theological interpretation that it couldn't tolerate being questioned, even by evidence. And that pattern didn't stop with Galileo. Think about Charles Darwin. In 1859, he published On the Origin of Species, introducing the theory of evolution by natural selection. Today, evolution is one of the most foundational ideas in all of biology. It explains the diversity of life on Earth in a way that has practical, observable, and predictive power. It's supported by genetics, fossils, embryology, and comparative anatomy. And yet, to this day, some Christians reject evolution outright, not because of a lack of evidence, but because it seems to contradict a literal interpretation of Genesis. For many, the idea that humans evolved over millions of years is seen as dangerous, even evil. But here's the thing. Science doesn't ask whether something feels right or whether it matches a specific religious story. It asks what the evidence says. That's its strength. Now let's be fair. Not all Christians reject science. In fact, many scientists today are believers. Francis Collins, the former director of the National Institutes of Health and leader of the Human Genome Project, is a devout Christian. He accepts evolution. He believes science and faith can coexist. And he's not alone. But there's a deeper problem worth looking at. Not just individuals who oppose science, but how certain ideas within Christianity have made it harder for science to grow freely. Take the concept of faith over reason. In many Christian traditions, people are taught that belief, especially belief without evidence, is a virtue. Doubting, asking too many questions, or insisting on proof can be seen as weakness, even rebellion. The Apostle Thomas, for example, is remembered as doubting Thomas because he needed to see the risen Jesus to believe. But in John 20:29, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." For a scientist, that's a troubling idea. Science is built on the idea that we should question everything. Nothing should be accepted on faith alone. We test, we observe, we revise our ideas when new evidence appears. This mindset is often in direct tension with religious traditions that discourage questioning sacred texts or challenging spiritual authority. And that brings us to education. In many parts of the world, especially in the US, there have been fierce battles over what gets taught in public schools. Should creationism be taught alongside evolution? Should science teachers be required to teach the controversy, even when there's no scientific controversy? In 1925, the Scopes trial, also known as the monkey trial, put this question on center stage. A teacher named John Scopes was taken to court for teaching evolution in Tennessee. The trial became a media spectacle. The courtroom arguments revealed a deep cultural divide. One side defending religious tradition, the other standing for scientific literacy. Even now, almost a century later, some Christian groups push to include intelligent design, a form of creationism repackaged in scientific language, in school curricula. But courts have ruled that intelligent design isn't science. Why? Because it begins with a conclusion that life was designed by a higher power and looks for evidence to support it instead of the other way around. That's not how science works. And while not every Christian supports these efforts, the fact remains, Organized Christianity has often stood on the side trying to limit or reshape scientific education. Let's look at medicine too. Historically, Christian doctrine has sometimes slowed progress in healthcare, especially when it came to issues like vaccination, birth control, and end-of-life care. Some religious groups refused vaccines because they believed sickness was a spiritual matter, not a biological one. Others opposed stem cell research, even though it held the potential to cure diseases like Parkinson's or spinal injuries, because the cells came from embryos. These are real ethical debates, and they deserve thoughtful discussion. But often, the resistance wasn't based on scientific risk. It was based on doctrine. In some Christian circles, faith healing is promoted as a replacement for medical care. People have died from treatable conditions because they believed prayer alone would heal them. That's not science being ignored. That's science being replaced by religious belief. We also need to talk about how Christianity has, at times, shaped attitudes toward the environment. Some Christians interpret Genesis 1:28, where God tells humans to subdue the earth and have dominion over all living things, as a license to exploit nature without concern. This mindset has contributed to resistance against environmental science, including climate change research. Now let's be careful here. Many Christians take environmental stewardship seriously, but historically, the idea that nature exists for human use, rather than as a system we're part of and responsible for, has roots in a theological worldview. And this has consequences. When religious beliefs prevent people from acting on climate science, from teaching children biology, from funding medical research, or from questioning old ideas, then that religion isn't just a personal faith. It becomes a public obstacle. Again, not every Christian holds these views. Many don't. But it's important to ask, why do these patterns keep repeating? Why has Christianity, more than some other traditions, been tied so often to scientific resistance? Maybe it's because Christianity, especially in its more literal or fundamentalist forms, is based on fixed truths. The Bible is seen as the Word of God, unchanging, perfect, and final. Science, on the other hand, is always changing. It's okay with uncertainty. It grows through mistakes. It invites revision. That's hard to reconcile. When you believe a book contains absolute truth, new ideas can feel like threats. Not because they're false, but because they challenge what people are told they must never doubt. And yet, science and faith don't have to be enemies. They ask different kinds of questions. Science asks, how? Religion asks, why? But the trouble starts when one tries to do the other's job. When religion tries to explain natural phenomena, it usually gets it wrong. When science tries to tell people how to live meaningful lives, it sometimes comes up short. But in their proper places, both can offer something valuable. Still, the history is clear. Christianity has often promoted anti-scientific thinking. Not always, and not everywhere, but often enough that we should take notice. Not to shame, not to blame, but to learn. We live in a world where science saves lives, feeds billions, connects people across the globe, and helps us understand where we come from. If we're serious about truth, we should let science speak freely, even when it challenges old beliefs. And maybe, just maybe, our faith can grow deeper when it makes room for doubt, evidence, and the endless curiosity that makes us human. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, consider sharing it with someone who's open to thinking more deeply about science and faith. Let's keep the conversation going, respectfully, honestly, and with open minds.